It is a new week, and it is a week watching out for what Lee might mean for the U.S. East Coast. Meteorologist Joe Martucci here, along with my weather brother Sean Sublette in Richmond, Virginia. Sean, over the weekend, Lee was quiet for land, as we expected. No threats to
hmm
land. But coming into Monday, some of these forecast tracks are bringing it awfully close to some parts of the Northeast and Atlantic Canada.
Yeah, I think that's the big takeaway from today is that over the weekend it pretty much did what we expected it to do. And in the next 48 hours, it's going to start to accelerate northward. And as we mentioned last week, the biggest risks were going to be north of Long Island. And really, that looks like it's still going to be the case. So on our notes, we expect that next 48 hours is when it is going to peak in its strength. But even though uh, it will probably not make landfall in the southeast or the Jersey Shore, high waves and rough surf are expected up and down the East Coast this week. And we'll get into the particulars of why that is. But too long don't read. Uh, Remember, the hurricane's not a point. So let's get it started, Joe. Take us through what the conditions are down there with Lee now.
Yeah, so Lee right now is a category 3 hurricane, maximum sustained winds of 120 miles an hour here. It's trying to get an eye back together. It did have it earlier this morning, probably undergoing what we call eye wall replacement right now. You see, with the storm, it's starting to tighten up too in the past couple of frames, which tells me it is starting to strengthen. It's not getting sheared out, meaning that the cloud
Mhm.
bands are, pushing far away from the center here. So, as we said, strengthening is expected with this. We'll take you through the 5 day forecast from the Hurricane Center. And you see category 3 strength through about tomorrow evening. And then it cuts to the north. And you see that cone getting awfully close to Nantucket and probably Cape Cod, perhaps Boston, as we go into this weekend. Now, this is only where the center of the storm would be. It's important to note, even if it took the exact center track of this storm, I still think you'd be in that shield of precipitation and strong winds, tropical storm force winds at least, in Cape Cod. But right now, the Hurricane Center forecast is for it to take it safely away from land anywhere from Long Island south, which is what we were telling you last week. Now, we look at the spaghetti plots. These are ensemble members. In short, it's taking a number of different computer model runs and we're plotting it on this map. A lot of the consensus is taking it into not so much Cape Cod, but more into Maine or Nova Scotia here. That CLP5, I will say, that's been an outlier like since last week for whatever reason, just with the track of the storm here. So it does look like landfall is likely somewhere in North America. Is it going to be Eastern New England or is it going to be Nova Scotia? That is too early to tell. But if you're anywhere in, let's say, where I am in Atlantic City on south into, Virginia or the Carolinas, rough surf, rip currents, coastal flooding. We have the new moon coming as well, which elevates tide. So definitely rough on the water, even though the direct impacts likely stay away, again, if you're south of Long Island. And the reason why it's going to maintain hurricane strength so far north is because of how warm the waters are, right, Sean?
Right. The water is very warm all the way up to about the latitude of Atlantic City. But then once it goes farther north, approaching the Gulf of Maine, Bay of Fundy, that's when the water temperatures drop even more dramatically. And as Joe, as you alluded to, up to this point, it's been sitting in this bath water, right? Low, mid, upper 80s. Then those temperatures drop more in line with the upper 70s to
Yeah.
about 80 as it moves farther northward, about the same latitude as Bermuda. But one of the things we really want to remind people is that the hurricane is not a point. In fact, as these storms typically move farther north and they do run into cooler water, the wind field expands outward. We think of hurricanes and the worst of it really in this kind of concentrated area when they're at their worst. But as they move north over some cooler water, it's not like they just dissipate like nothing. The wind field expands outward. And this is what we look at here with the tropical winds. Remember here that everything that's kind of that yellow shade is at least 30 miles an hour. And even though the center is going to be awfully close to Bermuda, you've got a massive, massive wind field that is several hundred miles away from the center. Now, that doesn't mean that everybody on the coast is going to have 30 or 40-mile-an-hour winds. All right. As we get closer to the coast, the winds do slow down a little bit, but this is going to go a long way in determining what happens with the waves themselves. Take us through this, Joe. You're on the coast, man.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So we talk about the waves. You can feel those for hundreds, even 1,000 miles away. And I know here at the Jersey Shore, we already had long what we call wave periods. That's the number of time it takes for two waves to pass one point. The longer the wave period, the stronger the waves will be. Now we're looking at just the heights alone here. And you see, as we go into Tuesday and Wednesday, it actually expands these wave heights, even though maybe the core of it, the peak of the wave heights are shrinking, the amount of area that's seeing elevated wave heights increases. And on Friday here, I mean, you are talking about 5, 6 foot waves from Nantucket all the way down to Myrtle Beach, South Carolina. And then as we go into Saturday and Sunday, I mean, New England is going to have some very high waves. Even if it doesn't make landfall in Maine, it makes landfall in Nova Scotia. You're still talking about 10, 15-foot waves. And then if you're out to sea, again, you see some of these oranges, 35-foot waves here. It sounds preposterous, but that is what it is when you got a storm like this, and especially one that's going into what we call a concave
Mhm.
land system here, which means it's kind of curving a little bit. You see from Boston to Maine to Halifax, kind of makes like that half moon shape there.
It just
So a
kinda,
lot of water is going to get funneled into.
yeah.
Sean, what is that area between Halifax, Nova Scotia, and Maine? Is that the Bay
Bay
of
of
Fundy?
Fundy, the Bay
Fundy,
of
Bay of
Fundy,
Fundy.
the
Uh,
biggest tidal swings back and forth on the whole dang planet is in the Bay
yes,
of Fundy.
Google that because that's actually pretty impressive to see that.
That's wild. I hope to see that in person someday.
Yeah, well, you Sean might if you take your cross Atlantic flight later this week, you might see those waves build up. But anyway, again, high surf, rough waves out there. And remember, even if you're in South Carolina, North Carolina, most lifeguards are not on the beaches during the week now that it's past Labor Day. So you want to really just don't go in the ocean. It is not safe here. That's not all though. We still have more tropical systems to look out for, Sean, including two way out in the Atlantic.
Once we put Lee to bed, and that's going to be, this weekend, coming weekend, there are things out in the distant East Atlantic. There are two systems that have come off the African coast. One of these in yellow there is very weak. That's probably just going to dissipate. But that one in orange, you see the little X on the right side of the screen, that moves out into the more open waters of the central Atlantic, and the Hurricane Center is very bullish on this becoming a legit tropical cyclone, tropical storm, perhaps hurricane in the coming 5 to 7 days. Should that happen, it would be called Nigel. So this is something to keep way in the back of your mind, back burner, not this week, not even the first of next week. This is 10 to 14 days away. So there's lots of time to keep an
Yeah.
eye on this. And as we like to remind people, there are computer models that go that far in advance. But as they told me in an undergraduate, those things are kind of like dreamland. They really don't reflect reality. So don't fret too much over some piece of guidance that somebody might post online.
Right,
But the
exactly.
point is, we still got a long, long way to go in this hurricane season, right, Joe?
Yes, and welcome to the peak of hurricane season. We
Mhm.
are at the top. It is right around this weekend where we peak with the most number of tropical storms and hurricanes and major hurricanes in the Atlantic. Even though we have two right now in the Atlantic, that's still pretty decent. We don't have five like we had a few weeks ago, but we still are at the peak now here, and we kind of remain. There's kind of like two levels to this. We're kind of in this main peak through about, we'll say later part of September, and then it
Yeah.
takes another drop, but we're still fairly elevated with tropical season through about the middle of October, and then it really starts to tail off after that. So take us home, Sean, with some notes.
Yeah, so with Lee, it probably is going to peak in its intensity within the next 48 hours and then begin to accelerate northward. So the biggest threat is going to be in North America, the areas northward from Long Island, and probably not even Long Island Sound, but we're thinking more like Rhode Island, Massachusetts, Maine, going north into the Gulf of Maine, New Brunswick, and Nova Scotia, Bay of Fundy. Those are the areas that I think should be on most alert for what is likely coming in the next 4 to 6 days. But even away from those locations, if you're at the coast, from Boston all the way down to Myrtle Beach, high waves and rough surf all up and down the East Coast this week as the storm pushes northward. And we can't say it enough. Joe, because you were in Jersey in 2012, just because this thing weakens to a category 1 doesn't mean the waves suddenly go away. I think everybody has seen that,
Yeah.
but it is an important thing to remember.
Hey, and the winds too, right, Sean? I think Sandy at the time had the largest wind field for a
Right.
hurricane, and it was a category 1. That was it. And we've all seen the pictures from Sandy. I of course was in it, so I'm very aware of it. But it doesn't just because it's a Cat 5 doesn't mean that, oh my God, the wind field's at its largest. Not always the case. It's usually when it weakens. We'll say one more thing too before we wrap up. It is
Mhm.
September 11th. Thoughts and prayers with
Amen.
everyone who was affected by September 11th here, whether it was in New York, DC, Pennsylvania, or anywhere across the country here. Um, we'll never forget, Sean. Do you remember where you were September 11th?
Oh, most definitely. I was working at an NBC affiliate in Roanoke, Virginia. We had one skyscraper in small Roanoke, Virginia, and we evacuated that. It was a very harrowing day. It is hard for me to imagine being in the Northeast at that time, the way you were. But I have friends there who were, had to run from debris. I did not know anybody in the towers, fortunately, but my heart goes out to everybody who was affected. And I always think about the first responders in New York who put their lives on the line to save others.
Yeah, and even from beyond New York, who drove in that day
Right.
just to
Right.
help. It was incredible. I'll just say this too. One of the continuing reasons why I'd like or knew I wanted to be a meteorologist, growing up, in part was because of September 11th. Sean, I grew up in Union, New Jersey, about 15
Hmm.
miles west of New York City, and you would see on NBC. We used to watch NBC 4. Shout out NBC 4 in New York, the wind forecast, because if the winds were
Yeah.
east, which does not happen often, but if they were east, they would be blowing our way to smoke and debris.
Yeah.
And there were graphics made showing which way the smoke and debris would be going. So I remember seeing that as a
Yeah.
kid and was just so astonished to see how weather, and something so man-made like a tower, and of course the tragic, horrible events that happened, kind of all come together. So,
There was a hurricane offshore. I think it was called Aaron.
oh,
And that
okay,
and that meant there was a north wind over the tri-state. So most of the smoke plume blew, most, not all of it, but most of it blew south, back offshore from the Jersey Shore,
yeah.
blowing south. So I'm very glad it wasn't an east wind, to be
Uh,
sure, that day.
Yeah, yeah, totally. But thoughts and prayers again, on September
Mhm.
11th. We're gonna wrap it up here for this episode of Hurricane Hunt. For Sean Sublette, I'm Joe Martucci. We'll be back with you, uh, of course, this week tracking Lee
Soon.
soon. Soon, we will talk to you soon. Take care, everybody.